Hi guys, it's time for our final novel that we would have been reading the end of the school year, and it's actually my favorite of the entire year, which I know is hard to believe because we've had so many good books, but this one just happens to be my favorite and I don't want you to miss out on it. And I feel really bad because we had so many families that paid, donated money or donated copies of the book, and it would be really unfair if everybody paid for a new set and then you didn't get to read it. So we'll be reading it together, just in a different way. I'll be reading it to you. The book is called Boston Jane, An Adventure. It's by Jennifer Holm. She's written a few really great novels, so if you end up liking this, it is a trilogy. There is a second and third book. I have them in the classroom, not a whole class set, just one. But I haven't read them yet, but I hear they're good. So if you do like this book, there are two more if you're looking for something to read. But like I said, this is my favorite one of the whole year, and I'm really excited to read it with you guys. So we will begin with chapter 1. And there are flashbacks in this, not as much as Holes, but the story starts off. Our main character is Jane. Her name is Jane, and it does take place in the mid-1800s. Like right after the gold rush. So people are traveling from the East Coast. She's actually from Philadelphia, same place as Maddie in Fever, only about 75 years later. So a lot of people are traveling west because of gold rush and things. So you'll have to figure out what happens. But this is Jane. And when we start off, she is on a ship traveling across the ocean and on her 16th birthday. And we start there, but then it's going to be a flashback to find out, okay, how did she end up on this ship for her 16th birthday? So chapter 1, or Miss Hepplewhite's Opinion. And each chapter is entitled from, Miss Hepplewhite ends up being this little teacher, and each chapter is going to be entitled with something with Miss Hepplewhite having to do with her. Papa always said, you make your own luck. But after being seasick for 5 months, 2 weeks, and 6 days, I felt certain that luck had nothing to do with anything aboard the Lady Luck. That's the name of the ship that she's on, is called the Lady Luck. A poorly named vessel, if ever there was one. I had just spent the morning of my 16th birthday puking into a bucket, and I had little hope that the day would improve. I had no doubt that I was the unluckiest young lady in the world. So the book starts off, she's on a ship. She's been on this ship for over 5 months, puking. So obviously she's seasick. She's not like any other kind of sick. She's just seasick. And she's saying, oh, poor me. I'm the unluckiest girl ever. Now she's going to flash back to, I think, when she's like 11, like your guys' age. It says, it wasn't always this way. Once I was the luckiest girl in the world. When I was 11 years old in 1849, the sea seemed to me a place of great wonder. I would lie on my 4-poster bed in my room, overlooking the street, and pretend I was on one of the sleek ships that sailed along the waterfront, returning from exotic, faraway places like China and the Sandwich Islands and Liverpool. When the light shone through the window a certain watery way, it was easy to imagine that I was bobbing gently on the waves of the ocean, the air around me warm and sweet and tinged with salt. We lived on Walnut Street, in a brick house with green shutters, just steps from the State House. Heavy silk drapes hung in the windows, and there was new gas lighting in every room. When the lights were on, it glowed like fairyland. I believed it to be the loveliest home in all of Philadelphia, if only because we lived there. So very different than Maddie and Fever. Jane has money, and you're going to learn that her father is a surgeon. So she lives in Philadelphia, but in a different part of Philadelphia, in a brick house, a 2-story brick house. We know she has more money because she mentions that she has heavy silk drapes. She has new gas lighting. So gas lighting had just been invented. So whenever you have something that's like a new invention, obviously you have to have money. So she's super happy. And my father was the most wonderful father in Philadelphia, or perhaps the whole world. Each morning, Papa would holler, "Where is my favorite daughter?" I would leap out of bed and rush to the top of the stairs, my bare feet, my hair a frightful mess. "She is right here," I would shout, "and she is your only daughter." "You're not my Janie," he would roar, his white beard shaking, his belly rolling with laughter. "My Janie's not a slug-a-bed. My Janie's hair is never tangled." My mother had died giving birth to me, so it had only ever been Papa and me. Papa always said that one wild red-headed daughter was enough for any sane man. As for my sweet Papa, how can I describe the wisest of men? Imagine all that is good and dear and generous, and that was my Papa. Papa was a surgeon, the finest in all of Philadelphia. He took me on rounds with him to visit his patients. I was always proud to hold the needle and thread while he stitched up a man who had been beaten in a bar brawl. Or I would sit on a man's belly while Papa set a broken leg. Papa said a man behaved better and didn't scream so much when a little girl was sitting on his belly. I was the luckiest girl. How could I not be with Mrs. Parker's cherry pie? Mrs. Parker was our housekeeper, and she made the best cherry pie in the entire world. I ate it at every opportunity. Papa always said that I was going to turn into a cherry pie myself one day if I wasn't careful. This was Mrs. Parker's cherry pie. All tangy cherries rolled up in a golden buttery crust. It was as sweet as clean sheets on washing day, as warm as the chair by the kitchen stove on a cold afternoon. Just imagine it sitting on the plate waiting for you, all piping hot from the oven. There's nothing better in the world than a slice of Mrs. Parker's cherry pie after a long day of stitching up bleeding heads, Papa always said. I couldn't agree more. After Mrs. Parker's cherry pie, the best part of the evening was talking to Papa. He had the most interesting way of looking at things. "Papa," I said one evening, finishing up the last crumbs of my pie, "Mrs. Parker is complaining that she can't find any decent help because all the young girls want to take factory jobs." Papa leaned back in his chair and lit his pipe and puffed. "Well, Janie, dignity is very important. Maybe some of these girls don't think it's very dignified washing someone else's laundry and emptying other people's chamber pots. What do you think?" So Mrs. Parker is their housekeeper, and she wants to hire a young girl to assist her. And we remember back earlier in the year, we studied what the factories were like in the 1800s. Remember, we looked at some poems. Remember how abusive they were, how they would hire children and women, and they would barely pay them anything, and work them really, really hard. So that's the time period. So these women are getting jobs in the factory, and Mrs. Parker can't find anyone. And Janie's kind of wondering, like, why not? So he says, maybe they don't want to empty people's chamber pots. So if you remember, a chamber pot was the pot that people would go to the bathroom in, and then the servant would have to come and empty that out. So I don't know if you'd want that job. Would you want a job emptying someone's, potty, or would you want to work in a factory? You'd have to think about that. So that's what Papa is talking with her about. "What do you think? Would you rather work in a factory or empty chamber pots?" he asked. It made me think, an activity Papa encouraged. "Speak up, Janie. Say what's on your mind," Papa always said. You're going to see this is very different than during this time period. Remember, we've talked about how women were treated and the expectations, how women were meant to be quiet and do what they were told and not have opinions and not speak out. So Papa is raising her very differently. Remember, her mother is dead. She died giving birth to her, which unfortunately did happen. So it's just her and her dad and the housekeeper. So her dad's raising her to be different than the other women. So just remember how women were at this time. "I don't imagine it would be very nice to empty chamber pots," I admitted. "But I didn't think the factory would be very nice either. The women who worked in factories had swollen ankles from standing on their feet all day." Papa brought home books from the library company where he was a member, and we read them together after supper. My favorite story was Rip Van Winkle by Mr. Washington Irving. Rip Van Winkle drinks too much liquor, falls asleep under a tree, and wakes up 20 years later. Rip Van Winkle greatly resembled the men of Philadelphia who spent their evenings drinking at taverns until they were senseless. It seemed a very silly activity. "Papa," I asked, "why are men always drinking too much liquor and getting into trouble?" "It is a great mystery, Janie, but," and here Papa grinned, "it keeps your old poor pa here in business." And he was right, because sure enough, every evening after the taverns closed, I'd be woken by some drunken fool roaring that he was bleeding to death on our front porch, and would the good doctor please come out and sew him up. Papa would let me get up and help him, and when we were finished, he would make me a glass of warm milk and honey and tuck me into bed. "Where is my favorite daughter?" he would say, tweaking the end of my nose. "She is right here, and she is your only daughter," I would say with a sleepy smile, sinking into my soft, warm bed. Then I would close my eyes and dream of the sea and Mrs. Parker's cherry pie. Truly, I was the luckiest girl in the world. So there's a little flashback of when she was 11. It gives us a picture of what her life was like, wonderful relationship with her father. She loves her housekeeper. She loves the food. She loves her home. Very happy person. So then we have to say, okay, why is it that now she's on a ship leaving, right? Okay, so now we still have another flashback. "Then my luck changed. Here is how it happened." So this is going to be an event that's just going to kind of change her whole life. So we're back where she's 11. Jebediah was Mrs. Parker's boy and my favorite playmate. So she's playing with a boy. So we're going to see Jane as a bit of a tomboy. He was very clever and instructed me in all manner of useful things, such as how to throw clumps of manure at passing carriages, how to tease the butcher's dog without being bitten, and how to spit. I'm not boasting when I say I was excellent at spitting, the best in the neighborhood. Do you think that those behaviors are going to be ladylike? Throwing manure, spitting, playing with a boy? Not so much, but she loves it. That's her life, and she loves her life. "You're better than the pigeons themselves," Jebediah would say, awestruck at my ability to hit a gentleman's hat from the roof without the man even noticing. So they would get up on the roof and they would spit down onto people and hit their hats, and they wouldn't know. There were fellows who walked around Philadelphia all day who didn't even know that they had great gobs of spit on their hats. Jebediah was a fine spitter himself and quite adept at using the space where his two front teeth used to be to lob a fine one at a passerby. He'd lost his two front teeth when he'd slipped on a pad of manure and hit a cobblestone. Papa said that while spitting was a handy skill, the teeth would likely not grow back. The streets of Philadelphia were our playground, and how we played. We played with the newspaper boys and the orphans and the stray dogs, and Papa said we should, if at all possible, be careful to avoid the alleys where people were dying from cholera. One of our favorite games was lobbing rotten apples at the old tree outside the Biddle House on Arch Street. It was a towering tree that seemed to reach to heaven itself, and we would spend hours trying to see who could hit the highest branch. One autumn day, Jebediah and I were challenged to a throwing contest by two boys from Arch Street, Horace Fink and Godfrey Hale. I'm afraid that Horace was a disagreeable boy with big ears, and Godfrey Hale had a weepy eye and liked to stick his finger up his nose as if digging for gold. "Me first," Horace Fink declared, snatching up an apple. He waited for a passing carriage to go by and then threw. The apple just skimmed the trunk of the tree. "Even Jane can do better than that," Jebediah sniffed. He handed me a particularly rotten specimen of an apple. Horace Fink smirked at me. "You couldn't hit a stone wall." Jebediah rolled his eyes as if to say that Horace Fink was as thick as the tree he had missed. "Go on then," Godfrey Hale taunted. The sun was shining brightly, the air still, the rotten apple heavy in my hand. I looked at Horace Fink's smirking face. What was I to do? Really, did I even have a choice? Certainly not. I wound up and threw as hard as I could. And as the apple left my hand, Sally Biddle stepped out of her house. Need I tell you that Sally was everything that I was not? She was 13 and perfect in all respects. Her waist was thin as a ribbon, her golden hair always styled in ringlet curls to perfection, and her skin white as milk. She was as stiff and neat as her crisp petticoats. Time seemed to stand still, appalled, as my apple went flying through the air. It missed the tree completely and smashed square onto the bosom of Sally Biddle's pale rose dress. So it hit her right in the chest, this Sally Biddle coming out of her house. I froze. Then Sally Biddle let loose a scream so loud that windows up and down Arch Street shuddered and shook. Horace Fink hooted with laughter. "Bully for Jane," he shouted. Across the street, Sally Biddle was left in no doubt as to the identity of the guilty party. "Jane Peck," she hissed, eyes flashing. And that was the beginning of my bad luck. So that day, that moment when she hit Sally Biddle with that rotten apple, you're going to see how Sally Biddle is. She's a fun character. All right, so now we're back on the ship. 5 years later, as I sailed aboard the brig named the Lady Luck, it seemed bad luck was something I would never escape. You see, when I dreamed of my 16th birthday, I had pictured an afternoon tea with girls in lovely gowns, flowers everywhere, and perhaps even one of Mrs. Parker's cherry pies. It's fair to say I'd never imagined being stuck in a tiny, airless cabin, the same cabin that had been home for months on end. Instead of flowers and pie, I had a hard, narrow bunk, a rickety table and chairs, and a tiny window that wouldn't open, a most helpful feature. At the beginning of the voyage, I had attempted to make the cabin comfortable. I put a linen tablecloth on the table and set embroidered cushions on the chairs. I'd laid out new china, placed a crystal vase on a small shelf, and hung a mirror on the wall. Crystal and china, as we know, and mirrors are very breakable. So think about what a ship does. Think about what a ship does when you go in the storm. You're going to want to have all this out. Samuel, the cabin boy, had come by and looked around, dumbstruck. "You sure you want to be putting all that out?" he'd asked. That first night at sea, we sailed into a storm. Need I describe the horror that followed? The tablecloth slipped off. The cushions bounced about. The china shattered into a million pieces, and the mirror came crashing down. My companion, Mary, caught the crystal vase as it fell, and I later packed it away in my camphor wood chest, along with the cushions and tablecloth. But the broken mirror had seemed a bad omen. And we don't know who Mary is yet, but Mary is traveling with her. So when we do more flashbacks, you'll see who Mary is. In the place where the mirror had hung, Mary pegged up a piece of paper with 2 columns. The left column said, "Days at sea." The right column said, "Fleas killed." The cabin was absolutely bursting with fleas. No matter that we shook out our blankets every day and killed as many of the pests as possible, they multiplied with staggering speed. On the day of my birthday, I lay all morning on that hard wooden bunk, nearly unable to stand from seasickness. By noon, I was no better. The ship hit a wave and Mary groaned from her bunk on the other side of the cabin. She was nearly as sick as I. "Happy birthday, Jane, my girl," she said in her thick Irish brogue. Her face was ashen, which would be kind of reddish, and her black hair looked decidedly dull. "I expect Sally Biddle didn't spend her 16th birthday with her head over a bucket," I said, a miserable expression on my face. "No, but just thinking about that girl makes me want to puke," Mary said loyally, a spark lighting in her eyes. I smiled weakly. The ship rolled hard and her arm struck the bunk. She winced. "How is your arm?" I asked. Days earlier, I had awakened in the middle of the night to Mary's screams. Among the assorted vermin on board was a surfeit of rats who sauntered about as bold as you please. A big fat fellow had bitten her and then scurried off into a hole in the wall, his wormy pink tail slithering out of sight behind him. Now we know rats carry serious disease, so to be bitten by a rat like that would be very dangerous. Mary held up her arm with a grimace. Yellow pus leaked through the bandages. "I'd better change that," I said, and stood up. But before I could take a step, the ship hit a rolling wave. My belly heaved. I leaped for the bucket and sat down hard on a chair. At that most inconvenient moment, Father Joseph banged on our cabin door. "Mademoiselles," he'd called. Mary groaned from the bunk and pulled the covers over her head. Father Joseph was a French Catholic missionary. While Mary and I had spent most of the voyage being sick, he had spent most of it preaching, no doubt to be in good form to convert the savages we would find at the end of our journey. We tried to be polite to him, but Father Joseph did try one's nerves. So Father Joseph is a French priest, and he's coming west to try to convert the Native Americans into being Catholic. "Come in," I called. As he entered, I reluctantly gestured to the other chair. sliding the reeking bucket under the table with my foot. "And how does this day find you, Mademoiselle Peck?" "Tolerably well," I replied, "tolerably well if you consider being seasick and killing fleas respectable pursuits for a young lady on her 16th birthday." "I am here to talk to you about the savages," he announced, eyes shining. Father Joseph wore a thick black wool robe and collar, and his head was bald as an egg. He had huge hairy eyebrows that perched atop his eyes like fuzzy caterpillars. When he was excited, his eyebrows danced around most alarmingly. "Not the blasted savages again," Mary whispered from beneath her blankets, and even I groaned inwardly. It was his favorite sermon. He had preached it at least twice a week since leaving port. I could practically preach it myself by now. "It is our Christian duty to show the savages the way of Christ," Father Joseph began, waving his arms in swooping gestures, "for they are the most unfortunate of God's creatures," he declared. I murmured sympathetically. Privately, I considered us more unfortunate than the savages. At least they were on dry land. Father Joseph's eyebrows were twitching. "Death can come at any time. The kingdom of heaven is open to those who do God's will," he thundered, banging his fist on our rickety table for emphasis. It shuddered. "Father," I said, "the table." From the bunk, Mary moaned dramatically. "I think I'm gonna puke," she said loudly, and groaned again. Father Joseph eyed Mary's bunks warily. "Perhaps we can continue this another time," I suggested hopefully. "But mademoiselle," he hesitated. "Pass me the bucket, Jane, my girl." Mary groaned even louder. She started making retching noises, so that would be like, bleh. Father Joseph looked nervously at Mary's bunk and quickly stood up. "Another time then, mademoiselle," he said, and made a hasty exit. The door slammed shut. Mary's black-haired head popped up from beneath the covers. "Good riddance," she laughed, her eyes merry. "I've heard some of the lads say the church shipped him out so they didn't have to listen to his preaching." "That's not a very charitable thing to say," I admonished, but laughed. Mary was so naughty sometimes. Mary shook her head, which sent her curls flying. "I feel sorry for the savages. He'll bore them to death before he even converts the first of them." Mary was not much given to good manners, but I had hope for her. Look how far I had come. But then I'd had considerable motivation. Now we're going back to the day she hit Sally Biddle with the apple. You see, from the day my apple had made its acquaintance with her bodice, Sally Biddle had considered it her sovereign duty to torment me. One late autumn afternoon had found Jebediah and me playing in the street. We were tossing manure at the backs of carriages. "Jane, you really should use the fresh pats. They stick better," Jebediah suggested helpfully, flinging one at a passing carriage to demonstrate. Just then, Sally Biddle came sauntering down the cobblestone street, a gaggle of girls in her wake. "It's a disgrace the way you're always running around with scabby boys," Sally Biddle sniffed, tossing her blonde hair. Her corkscrew curls stood out like a pack of little pigs' tails all in a row. "An 11-year-old really ought to know better." I eyed Jebediah's knees. Come to think of it, they were scabby. "Just look at yourself," Sally continued. "No wonder all the mothers keep their daughters from you." The girls gave little nods of agreement. I looked down at myself, wondering what she meant. It was true my apron had a cherry stain on it, but this was no different from any other day. And perhaps my hair was a bit tangled and my nails were a bit stained, though that was to be expected when handling manure pats. All the mothers kept their daughters away from me? It had never occurred to me to wonder why the other girls never played with me. After all, I had Papa and Jebediah. "What do you mean?" I asked. But Sally Biddle ignored me and turned to the other girls. "My mother says it's a shame that Dr. Peck has never remarried, but that it's perfectly understandable. After all, what respectable lady would want to deal with a girl like Jane? It would be like bringing a street urchin into your home." She spoke conversationally, as if she were just discussing the weather or a new bonnet. I suddenly remembered all the times I'd come home late for supper, tracking manure from the street. How Papa would sometimes look at me and shake his head and sigh heavily. Was he secretly ashamed of me? Was I truly a disgrace? A cold, sick feeling curled in my belly. The corners of Sally's mouth turned up in a small smile. And the sight of that knowing smile made my back stiffen. The words tumbled from my mouth in a rush. "Papa loved my mother," I blurted. "He's never cared for another woman." Sally turned on me smoothly. Not a petticoat out of order, not a bow out of place. "Then he must not care for you very much." She paused, drawing the moment out. "After all, you're the reason she's dead." I stumbled back as if I'd been punched hard in the belly, the air going out of me in a rush, leaving my knees wobbly. The other girls looked at Sally and laughed uncomfortably. "She probably died from the shame of having a girl like you," Sally added, and burst into peals of laughter. I couldn't bear to hear any more. I turned and ran. Yeah, Sally Biddle. Can you imagine? I can't think of anything meaner to say to someone than, "Oh, your dad doesn't like you because you killed your mom and that was your fault." I mean, this girl is like next level of mean. Anyway, so now we know why Jane decided to change. Tomboy, happy, Sally Biddle starts getting in her head, and she lets her, and now she's starting to look at herself and think all these horrible things because Sally Biddle said that. So we're going to pause there. I'm pausing on page 13, and we will pick up next time. Thanks for joining.